Tens of thousands of football fans came to Highbury. Electrifying!
Yes, guys, and welcome back to the Cannon podcast. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you are all good. We are here to talk about episode 5 of the Data podcast. Me and George have just gone through roughly 50 to an hour long of looking at the topic of this podcast for this month, which is have Arsenal regressed? And we've gone into all sorts of different metrics to look at how Arsenal have fared in comparison to the 2 previous campaigns in which, we have seen this Arsenal team evolve from that 21-22 season, in which it became a team that was challenging from top 4 to then one that catapulted and was sustaining a league challenge and, doing that over 2 seasons then. And now we've got this season as well. So I think the big debate has been, with what's been happening in recent times, and also how the fan base is in terms of Mikel Arteta is, where are Arsenal going? Are we stagnating? Are we progressing? Are we regressing? And we covered that in depth. So if you want to check that out, you can access that content alongside previous data podcasts that we've done. We've done 4 previous podcasts as well, looking at different numbers. You can access it via the link below to become a Patreon or YouTube member. And now we're going to look at the thing that we kind of saved at the end that we wanted to discuss with you guys is Arsenal and as to whether they've been unlucky this season. So joining me is George. How are you, George?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me on. How are you getting on?
Yeah, good man. And I really enjoyed doing that that hour long worth of content with you, looking at those numbers and some really interesting things that we looked at. And now people are probably looking at, here comes the excuse merchants, but we will be going into all sorts of copium things, but with some more context. So yeah.
You get to share the screen?
Yeah, I can share my screen now.
Can you see it okay?
Yes.
Cool. So as Ryan mentioned, we've looked broadly across whether Arsenal have regressed this season. And one of the areas that we started to touch on the longer recording that we did for this was around player availability. And I think, I've put this under the section of how unlucky have Arsenal been this season, when it comes to obviously underperforming compared to previous seasons. I think a key component of that is obviously that's made out is around just the availability of particularly key players this season. So the first view I have is using data from Transfer Market. It's just looking at currently injured players who are valued over 30 million euros. So the key thing I wanted to point out really with this is just looking down this list, there's at least 6 players, including Martinelli, who have long-term injuries. And that, that obviously hopefully sets the scene to kind of going on to looking at this across the whole season as well. So the looking at kind of season on season, what I've managed to get to was just firstly just looking at the number of individual players who've been injured. So this season it's up at 18, whereas compared to previous seasons. So we're just getting much more players who have sustained some sort of injury this season. In terms of like measuring just the impact of that purely on the number of games that have been missed, this is around 175 compared to previous seasons as well. And obviously, this data is also extracting to the fact that Kai Havertz is out for the whole season and things like that. So this number will be pretty accurate unless there's obviously more injuries. What I've then done is stacked that, so by each of the seasons, but stacked it by player. And so you can see by games missed who were the kind of key absentees in the last 3 years. And so, in the previous seasons, obviously we had El Neni out for a long time, various injuries to Jesus, Smith Rowe, Tomiyasu, things like this. Last season, obviously the key injury was for Timber, who missed the majority of the season, as well as Thomas Partey. This season, you can just see the volume of players that have been injured, but also just the amount of time that each player has been missed. I think what was quite interesting, obviously Saka, who's our most valued player according to Transfer Market, whilst represents a 13 games without Saka is a big deal. What I've also done is then taken the value according to transfer market at that time to then try and give some weighting of that impact. So if I just move to this tab here, you can suddenly see that like Saka's portion suddenly becomes much larger. And if you're then comparing kind of the totals between each of the previous seasons, it's not just the volume of injuries and obviously the volume of games missed, but it's also these injuries to key players that we've been without for a large part of the season. So examples obviously include Jesus, Havertz, Saka, as I mentioned, Martinelli, Odegaard, and obviously Tomiyasu, who's despite being valued lower, just him missing the whole of the season is obviously why his area is so big. Ben White as well. So I thought this was an interesting way, not just to show like purely games missed, but try and add this component of what's the actual value of the player, just to kind of infer that we have not just had injuries, but long-term injuries and long-term injuries to key players.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? It's kind of like, you look at a team with a lot of injuries and it can look as that team's really been unlucky. But then when you dive a little bit deeper into it, it's to players that really don't offer that much substance to the squad. Whereas in Arsenal's case this season, I mean, you don't even need these charts to recognise the turbulence that we've endured in this regard, this campaign. We've not been able to establish any sort of continuity whatsoever because we've had key players miss substantial parts of the season. And that has had a massive effect on what Arsenal have been doing this season. And I know this is obviously going out. This has been released and has been recorded after the Nottingham Forest game and obviously the West Ham game, in which it has become a lot more volatile in terms of the opinions. And people obviously are frustrated, and I completely understand that. But there is a lot of context behind this. And, not having 4 of your star attackers available, now, and with Mikel mentioning it in his press conference as well, Martinelli and Saka both being out until the international break, it is difficult, and it's really had a massive impact on us this season. And I kind of went into this on the main podcast last week with Jordan and Alex, where every single team, right, in Premier League history has had players available, their key players available, in order for them to establish that goal of winning the league. Go through every single season. You can go to the Arsenal days with Thierry Henry as your talisman, and then you've got all the other players as well. But I'm just looking at specific individuals. Arsenal, Thierry Henry. Man United, Wayne Rooney. Man United towards the end of the Ferguson era, Van Persie and Rooney. Man City, Kevin De Bruyne. Liverpool, Mohamed Salah. Leicester, Riyad Mahrez, Jamie Vardy. Every single team has had these attacking stars available to be able to allow them to build that consistency in terms of attacking output that has been key in them winning the Premier League. And Arsenal haven't unfortunately had that. And this shows it very well, especially when you look at the magnitude of the weighted player value and the players that we are seeing absent. Like Saka to Arsenal is Salah to Liverpool. It's Haaland to Man City. So that's that side of it. Now, and we mentioned this a lot in the podcast as well. I want to give Liverpool a lot of credit as well, because Liverpool have been fantastic under Arne Slot. And we mentioned about the differences between Jurgen Klopp and Arne Slot this season, in which the squad is pretty much the same, barring one player, I think it is, that they bought. But he's done a lot of brilliant things. And even if Arsenal had a little bit more luck with their injuries, I still don't think we would be top, but we'd be closer. And this is the point that I want to stress, is that you're not going to be able to establish that goal, fight for that goal, if you have this sort of turbulence. And actually, and we go back to that to the hour-long recording that we did, that you'll be able to check out, is that when you look at the teams that we actually are comparing to, Arsenal 22-23, Arsenal 23-24, but then we've also done the comparisons to Liverpool, Manchester City. The teams that have not done very well from the metrics, in certain metrics, are Liverpool 22-23, in which they finished 5th. The reason why they finished 5th is because they had a lot of injuries. Man City this season and Arsenal this season. There is a consistent theme there of what is happening to those teams and why they're not getting, high points tallies. And this is what we're seeing this season. But I don't want to just make this an excuse culture, because, again, we spoke about it in the podcast. there are things that Arsenal haven't done well enough this season as well. And there are things that aren't just exclusive to injuries. There are things that Arsenal have been struggling with for many years now under Mikel Arteta against these physical mid-blocks that I've mentioned time and time again. They are our tactical kryptonite. The likes of West Ham, the likes of Newcastle, Fulham. These are teams that have had really good success against Arsenal in which they're looking to squeeze the middle of the pitch. They can match us physically and they're willing to suffer as well. They're confident in suffering out of possession, being able to defend deeper and to protect their box. They do that fantastically. And Arsenal this season have struggled against them. Arsenal last season also struggled against them. Arsenal in terms of positions can improve, and these are things that we haven't done well enough this season as well. So there's so many things to look at here, but when you go back to that bar chart, as you see, it has been very difficult, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think what the idea with this was to kind of try and quantify it to previous seasons. And I think player availability, I think, was always a key component of what Arteta was looking for from a player. And I think whilst that hasn't changed, I think we've also, been unlucky with the nature of the injuries and the fact that a lot of them are so long-term as well. The last area kind of around this sort of impact, and this was something I found that was shared by the amazing Scott Willis, who I think found this from Adam Voge, is actually looking at Arsenal's season-on-season non-penalty XG, comparing it obviously for 2022 to 2023, but also looking at the overall for this season where we have, and we've talked about this on the main podcast recording around that drop. But what they've managed to do is also isolate that for the games where one of Saka or Odegaard is missing versus the games where they've both been playing, which has been, quite limited, I suppose, just to getting that consistency. But even so, there still is that gap. So even with those two key players, there is still a gap, I suppose, in terms of the amount of non-penalty XG that Arsenal have created this season. So it's not to say injuries alone, but again, it's been obviously
there's like I said, there are other things that we simply can do better in. But I think this is also interesting because it's like Saka and Odegaard, they just generally haven't had a lot of games this season at all, so that can kind of work both ways. That chart could go, that XG of 1.65 could go, that could be lower or it could be higher, but you'd expect it to be higher because especially when you look at the success that Arsenal have had in terms of going forward. Saka and Odegaard have been, the partnership that has blossomed alongside of Ben White. So, yeah, it's something that you can see has really impacted us. But I do stand by. I think we've just not been able to develop any sort of consistency with the injuries that we've endured, and that's for me the driver of our season. And I think the graphics that you've shown here kind of show that as well.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, so we recorded an hour long, which we looked at all these sorts of different metrics and numbers behind Arsenal's performance this season in comparison to the last two seasons, in comparison to Man City and Liverpool. And you guys can check that out. Like I said, if you access the link in the description to become a Patreon or YouTube member, and you can also access all the other content that is available on the Cannon podcast, from scouted videos to youth podcasts to main podcasts, ad-free. There's all sorts of content that you guys can check out. So hopefully you'll be able to be excited by the things that we've been doing on the Data Podcast, and it's something that we want to keep scaling up. We want you guys to give your thoughts and opinions on future Data Podcast, in which we take your opinions on board and we look to kind of build the show around that. And we did that in the previous podcast, actually. There was a comment that came from the YouTube, and we found that really interesting, and we built the entire show around that. So we're really up to doing that, and that's how we want to kind of structure these videos. We want you guys to be the heartbeat. So yeah, hopefully we'll be recording a more fun, in terms of more positive Data Podcast in the next month. But yeah, it's a rough time, but we just got to keep going and see where this season takes us. But that's all from me. Any closing thoughts, George? No,
you've captured it well. I think a lot of the real detail we went through was on the main pod as well. So I would definitely encourage, if you're not a member already, either on YouTube or on Patreon, to check that out. But yeah, I think this was an interesting angle, but obviously one of many that we've gone through when it comes to have Arsenal regress this season.
Yeah, and I can tell you now, it's not all injuries and contests. We went into a lot of things, and also in terms of our cup performances as well. And that's something that just needs to improve on the mid-cap, And yeah, there's loads of things that we spoke about in that show. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did like this video, please give it a like, share, subscribe, do all sort of that stuff. And yeah, thank you for tuning in. And last but not least, thanks for keeping it Arsenal.